Hey, what's going on, nerds? Welcome back. This is No Demos episode 7, and it's been a long one. We've been out here digging and searching and seeking for all of the information we could find on this pedal right here, the companion FY-2 Fuzz. You probably know it, you've probably seen it, you've probably owned one, maybe you've owned multiple, and if you don't, you probably know someone that has owned one, because these were made for a very long time actually. And they were made by the thousands, and there were seemingly endless number of different brandings, OEMs, different little badges that you'll see here. But today what I want to do is focus on the very first version, which is this right here, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about all the history and everything that we think we know about them. We are going to bust some myths today. It's going to be a spicy one. I think you'll enjoy it. So let's get into it. First, what do we know about the companion FY-2? Well, we know it came out of the late 60s, made by Shin-ei from Japan. It was a 2-transistor circuit, hence the FY-2. If you know a little bit more about it, you know that that circuit is based off of a silicon fuzzrite. And yeah, that's about it. Those are the facts as we know them. But me being me, I always like to look at those things and question all of it, right? When exactly did it come out? Was it based off of a fuzzrite? All of these things. And so that's what I want to go into today. What many people don't know, actually, kind of myth number one, is there were actually 2 different versions of this pedal. This is version 1, and it is different from, say, this. Right? You've probably seen a million of these. This is version 2. Like I said, they all have a bunch of different brandings on them. Version 1 uses germanium transistors, and version 2 uses silicon transistors. And you're probably thinking, all right, that's kind of neat. I wonder how that sounds. Well, it's not as simple as it's the same circuit and they're just using different transistors. It's not, this is a germanium fuzzrite and that one's a silicon fuzzrite. It's actually 2 completely different circuits. And they are correct about the silicon version. It is essentially a fuzzrite. From what I understand, it's a fuzzrite with a tone portion kind of attached to it that scoops out the mid-range. And so what that gives you is actually a fairly different tone from a fuzzrite. You still get the insane splattiness of a fuzzrite, but you almost get that scoop tone that you would from a super fuzz, which is I think what they were going for. That would be my guess. And there were other pedals like this one here. Bring it over. Like this one here. A little too reflective. The Sakova wedge fuzz. And this came out, from what I understand, it looks like this came out before this. And this runs off of a completely different circuit, but it's kind of a similar-ish sound, where you have this big, thick, kind of scooped mid-range tone. And so that became that Japanese fuzz sound. But this one is completely different. This is actually based off of a germanium fuzz face. And I know what you're probably thinking, oh, another fuzz face, that's great. But they did something cool here. I don't have all the technical information. You can find the schematic online. I actually have it right here. But I can tell you how it sounds. It sounds awesome. This is about 20 times louder than this, and it's actually louder than any fuzz face I've ever played. It's basically like if you took a fuzz face and just made it uncompressed. It's just ripping and soaring and smashes the front end of your amp and sounds glorious. I mean, this is a really great sounding pedal. So now that we know that there's 2 different versions of this pedal, what my real question is when exactly did they come out? If you look up anything on the internet and you look up classic 60s fuzzes, this one is always listed. You have the Maestro fuzz tone, whatever, blah, 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 and you'll always see a companion FY-2. We know that it came out in the late 60s. The problem with that is a couple things. Number one, and this could be an entire video on its own, but in February of 1967, a new brand in Japan was started, and that brand was Honey. And they came out with this pedal, the Honey Baby Crying Fuzz, which became the Super Fuzz. So this is the very first version of it. This rusty, beautiful little baby here. And so I have my suspicions, and my guess is that Honey had actually hired or contracted Shin-ei to build their pedals while they built the amps in-house. I have a whole reasoning for that. We can go into that later. Again, that's just a guess. And please, if you want to argue with me on that, go right ahead in the comments or send me an email. I would love to be able to work that out. But that's what I think happened. The problem, though, is that in 1969, so just 2 years later, Honey goes out of business. They go bankrupt. And it appears as though as they start selling off stock, and Shin-ei seems to take over. They decide, all right, well, this is my guess, we're already building the pedals, and we already have some OEM contracts with other brands. Let's keep those going. Let's make more of them, and let's make our own brand. And that's where Companion comes in. But the problem is, like I said, that doesn't happen until 1969. So then when did this come out? Did this come out in 1969? Well, the nice thing is, with Shin-ei pedals, for the most part, almost all of them have these date stamps on the bottom. And these stamps will tell you exactly when something came out. And essentially what these stamps are, you'll see them on a ton of electronics, really from the 40s through to the 80s. I have a Yamaha synth over there that has one of those stamps on it from the 80s. And how they worked is that typically at the end stage, so you're at the quality control stage, you've built the pedal, now you just need to test it and make sure that it works properly before boxing it and then sending it off to a distributor. And after you've tested it and it works properly, then you hit it with a stamp, and now we know, okay, this is a tested, perfectly working unit, I can send this off. And they stamped it with the date that they were doing it on. Now this date, if you look, it's kind of hard to read, but what that says is 45 and then 6. The second number we know is the month, so that would be June. But what is 45? It clearly can't be 1945. So what does that mean? In Japan at the time, what they were using was a dating system that was based on the reign of the current emperor, and this was called the Showa era at this time. And so what you see is 45th, so that'd be the 45th year of that era. And so all you have to know to figure out the date is what year did that start. And I believe it was 1926. So if we count from 26, the 45th year of that would be 1970. So that's kind of a conundrum, because we know that these came out in the late 60s. And now you see the very first version of it, and you see a 1970 date on that. So I thought, okay, well, maybe they made these for a while. Okay, so I went and I looked at not just these, because there aren't many of them. I looked at every Shin-ei pedal that I could find. And I'm talking hundreds online. There are literally hundreds of pictures of pedals on the internet. I have some here myself, and I looked through every single one and every single date stamp. I cataloged all of them. And actually, if you would like to know, because they kind of changed their stamps over time, I did make a blog post on the Tone Machines blog just about this. I have a little chart that I made that you can quickly glance at, and it can tell you exactly when your pedal came out. So I'll put a link in the description for that, and go check it out. So now, like I said, I looked at hundreds and hundreds of examples of Shin-ei pedals over the years, and the earliest date that I've been able to find on anything is March of 1970. And again, I know what you're thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense. But it does make sense if we've been wrong this whole time. And it makes more sense when we know that Honey went out of business sometime in 1969. And I feel like the time it would take to decide you're going to go into business yourself and create a new brand and create a brand new pedal, that would take some time. And I think that they didn't actually start until March of 1970, because I didn't just find that March of 70 date on some pedals. I found it on quite a few, and I didn't find a lot from the rest of that year. which leads me to believe they were building a bunch of these pedals, and then they had, all right, here's our launch date. It's going to be the spring of 1970. Maybe they had conceived of the idea earlier. Who knows? But 1970 at least is going to be when, I guess, Companion began as a brand. And so there we go. We have 1970 is when these probably came out. This one specifically is June. Now, I've only ever seen 5 Germanium versions of this ever. There's not a lot of them. So then my question is, when did they come out and how long were they out? So the earliest that I've seen stamped on one of these is also March of 1970. And I've only been able to find dates on 3 of them. There's 2 more that unfortunately I don't own, and I haven't been able to actually see the date code on. So those are going to have to be a mystery for now. But like I said, that March date seems to be the accurate inception of the Companion FY-2. And so then how long were they made? So that was another thing I looked at. Since I can't find many of these, the next thing I tried to do was look at every silicon version that I could find and see if I could find a very early date. And I did. I found one from November of 1970, and I was so excited to find it that I bought it. And here it is. And we look here, 4511. So there we go, November of 1970. And this would be, at least that I've been able to find, the earliest version of a silicon FY-2. So pretty sweet, but if you think about it, that only leaves 8 months that we know of at the most, 8 months that these could have existed, which is probably why there's so few of them out there. Now when it comes to the Germanium version, like I said, I've only seen 5. This one's actually rare in the fact that it still has its nameplate, because many of them, I don't know if they just use a terrible glue to put them on, but many of them fall off just like this. So these early ones from 1970, a lot of times you find them, they have no nameplate at all. That being said, the ones that I have seen, I have only seen 2 brandings. I've seen Companion and I've seen Tempo. I have not seen any other ones. Doesn't mean they couldn't exist. It's possible. Again, if you have a Germanium version, really at all, but especially if you have one with a different nameplate, I would love to know. But as of now, those are the only 2, Companion and Tempo. Now another thing to note about these, we mentioned it earlier, is this is a Germanium fuzz face circuit for the most part. This one specifically, it has the transistor type on the bottom, 2SB56, and there's 2 of them. Now, what's interesting about that is that my specific pedal does not use those transistors, but the other 2 that I've been able to look inside of do, and those are the 2 earlier ones. This one, a couple months later, uses 2SB175s, and that won't matter yet, but it will a little bit later. We'll talk about that then. So now we know essentially when these came out, which is March of 1970. That's at least a good date to kind of go off of for now. Haven't found one earlier, have not found no evidence of them being earlier, so that's what we're going to go off of. And it does make sense for the history of the brand. And so the next thing I want to look at is what happened before this. Was there anything that was built before this? Where did this circuit come from? Did they create it? So in order to do that, I had to dig a little bit further, and I remembered a pedal that kind of stuck out in my mind. And the reason it stuck out in my mind is because it looks like it's an exact clone from the same period of this pedal, and that's the Yak YF1. Now, Yak is a Japanese brand. Unfortunately, I don't really know anything about them. It's almost impossible. I've asked some friends of mine from Japan who are also collectors. They seem to know nothing about the brand. But I do know that there was at least 3 pedals that they came out with. The very first was a fuzz. It was called the DA1. And if you look at the DA1, and if you're vintage fuzz inclined, you will probably recognize that it looks very similar, if not identical, to the Acetone FM1. And it was most likely a clone of that pedal. And if you look at the front plate and all the labeling on it, clearly they got their inspiration from that. The circuit is very similar to it, but it was modified a little bit. The next was the YF1. And if you look at the YF1, and if you look at this, again, they look almost identical. I mean, the plate on the front, the labeling's the same. It looks like the same people made both. And then they had the YF2, which I happen to have right here. So here's the YF2. It's bigger. There you go. This one you can switch. So it kind of has a super fuzz deal going on with it. Has a cool little on-off pot. Really awesome sounding fuzz. Now I own this, so I'm able to look inside, and this is a 3 silicon transistor fuzz that doesn't seem to be based off of really much anything else. I'm sure it has, you know, it's a derivative of some things just smashed together. But it's an awesome pedal. Now what I don't own is either the DA1 or the YF1. Now the DA1, I have been able to find pictures of the inside, and I've been able to find some discussion of it. And the DA1, like I said, that is actually a germanium transistor fuzz based off of most likely the FM1 from Acetone, which in itself is based off of a Maestro fuzz tone. And so you get this string of pedals where here's one thing, and we're going to tweak it a little bit, and then we're going to take that tweak and tweak that a little bit, and you get a couple steps away. The one thing I did not know, and I could not find, was what the inside of the YF1 looked like. I've had pictures of the back of the board, the trace side of the board, and that's all I was able to find. So I decided, okay, well, let's look at what we do have, right? Because it's intriguing. It's interesting that it looks exactly like this. And I've always thought that's a clone of this. And stupidly, I actually passed a few up back in the day. Just because of that. I was like, I don't need another FY-2 Fuzz. So I decided to look more into it, and I messaged my friend Bart from FXDB. We were talking about it, and he pointed out that there's a number on the back of the PCB. And what's interesting is the YF2 and the YF1 both use the YF2 PCB. And why that's interesting is that if you look at the YF1, you can clearly see that there are some holes not being used, which means that they essentially just recycled the board, came out with it at the same time, used the same board, but the YF1 looks like it's a completely different circuit. And again, I didn't know, is it completely different, or is it just omitting this section, this tone section? But what Bart pointed out was this right here. Let's see if we could see it. Can't I put up a better picture? But what that says is 43 and then 6, I believe. Bart said, I wonder if that's a date code. And then it hit me. It is a date code, and it uses the same Showa dating system, because it doesn't just say 43.6, and if you look at the other one that I'll put a picture up of, it says S43.6, which means, my guess, Showa. And if we know that 45 means 1970, then that would mean that it's from 1968. Well, if that's from 68, that really kind of flips things upside down. The DA1, if you look at that one, I believe that's February of 1968. So then a couple months later, we get the YF1 and YF2. So now my question is, what is inside the YF1? We know the YF2 is silicon. We know the DA1 is germanium based off of Maestro. I have to know what is in the YF1. And so I reached out to a handful of friends that I knew owned them, and unfortunately one of them had sold his, another one had his buried in a pile, and another friend had moved recently. Well, luckily a couple weeks later, the friend who had moved recently reached back out to me, and it also happened to be Bart from FXDB. And he said, I found the pedal. And so kind of in real time, he's messaging me and he's sending me pictures as he's digging it out of other pedals of his and slowly opening it up and slowly taking off the board with a little screwdriver. And I'm thinking, I bet this has the same circuit as this does. And I bet it's going to have germanium transistors. And I'm kind of hoping that's what it is, because then a lot more things will make sense. And so he's sending pictures as he's going, and then here it comes, the gut shot, and he sends the picture, and I look at it, and sure enough, germanium transistors. And I have a couple friends look it over, and more sure enough, it's the exact same fuzz face circuit that you find in the FY-2. I don't know if you remember a little bit ago, we were talking about this pedal and how on the bottom this says it has two SB56 transistors, but remember when I said this had different transistors? Well, when we looked inside of that Yak Fuzz, guess what it had? It had the same 2SB175 transistors that this uses. And so I start thinking to myself, well, that's odd, and that's kind of crazy. You know, maybe Shin-ei made that pedal too, right? And maybe it's not them really stealing it. They just kind of they've already had that person, whoever invented that, already worked for them, and now they're gonna make this. And so I decided to look into it a little bit more, and then it hit me. What is YF2 or YF1? I would guess that means Yak Fuzz. YF. Seems to make sense. Okay, but what is FY-2? That doesn't make sense, because we know that this pedal is actually called the Fuzz Master, just like Ace Tone, and which that in itself is kind of funny and interesting. So then what is FY-2? Now, people have always made fun of the YF2 as just simply flipping the letters around. But now that we know that that's older than this, so did they just flip the letters around and they had no idea what it meant? And they're like, all right, well, we're going to rip the pedal off. Let's just rip off the name of the pedal too. Why not? So if that is the case, we still have the possibility that Shin-ei built that pedal as well. And they are Yak as well. And it wouldn't be quite as nefarious as we had thought. So I wanted to look at a couple other things. And then I remembered, if you look at this pedal, and you look at this one, now this is the silicon version that came right after it. Do you see any differences in the nameplates? I'll give you a second. Alright, I'm going to point it out. This one has an on-off switch. And it says off right here. This one does not. So this is the silicon version. It's just smooth, goes the whole way down, and does not say off right here. Alright, that makes sense. But now let's introduce this one. So this is the later version. I think I can fit all these in the frame. Whatever, we don't need that first one. So let's look at these. Now do you see a difference other than the knobs themselves? So now when you look, the big difference is that this says volume and this says SW volume. So it took me a second, I'm like, what the hell is SW? What does that even mean? And then I realized SW means switch. And if you look back at this, what it's telling you is that this pot, in addition to being volume, is an on-off switch. Well, when they decided to make it the silicon circuit, this was no longer a switch, so they took the off. But I don't think they knew what that meant. And because they didn't know what it meant, they left it on there. They just thought, oh yeah, SWVOL, that's clearly what that is called. We'll just leave it like that. And at some point, a couple years later, they figured it out and took off the SW, and it just became volume. Now, if you had been the person that invented the Yak Fuzz, you would know that SW means switch, and you wouldn't have made that mistake when switching over to this one. Taking the off from here, okay, yeah, you know what that means. how are you going to miss that? That just seems strange to me. And again, that doesn't technically or specifically mean that that's what happened, but it does seem to be a pretty good argument for it. So now we have the Yak Fuzz, which is almost has to be where they got the idea for this. I would love to know more about Yak. If you happen to have one of those pedals or know anything about the brand, please reach out. Please let me know. So Shin-ei was essentially ripping off Yak for this pedal. Then the next question is, did they rip off somebody else for this pedal? So far, I haven't been able to find anything earlier that is the silicon circuit. Doesn't mean it's not out there. Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. But I haven't been able to find it. So that's up in the air as of now. So we're going to give Shin-ei credit for this. But we might be pulling their credit for this version. So another big thing that people don't really know about the FY-2 just in general, the silicon version, like I said, that's 99% of the versions that you're going to see, were made until 1979. That seems to be when Shin-ei went out of business in total. But you could still get them after that for a couple years, and that's what these are. And that's why if you see a Kinbara pedal, most likely it won't have a date stamp. It'll be nice and clean like that. Probably comes with the box, just like mine did. And what I believe happened is that the same thing that happened with Honey is that Kinbara bought up the remaining stock of FY-2s and probably a couple other things. I think there's a Fuzz Wah and things like that from Shin-ei when they were going out of business, and decided they were going to try to sell them. Although by that time in 1980, you didn't have a lot of these bigger pedals. You also didn't have a lot of people going for this type of sound. So I don't think these sold very well, clearly, which is why most of the ones that you see look almost new, like this one here. So were they built by Shin-ei? Yes-ish. But they also were made after the company had gone out of business. And the reason I figured this out is because there is a catalog, a British guitar catalog that I've been able to find, and there's years of them in a row online. And in 1979, they were still selling the companion version, and in 1980, it switches over to the Kinbara version, which is right at the time that we know Shin-ei themselves went out of business. Alright, I think I got through everything I wanted to. The video is not quite as long as I thought it might be, so that's good. I'm sure I missed some stuff. If I did, I apologize. Maybe I'll make another long blog post later on in the future. But hopefully we busted some of those myths, and hopefully we changed some minds about the history of this awesome pedal, the companion FY-2 Fuzz. Alright, this has been No Demos, episode 7. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you on the next one. Peace.